Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Vibrant Music Teacher Chat. This is our weekly YouTube show where we talk about everything you need to know to be a great music teacher who has the passion to keep it going for the long term. If you're new here, please do say hello in the chat, and if you're returning, welcome back. Today we have a special guest. Penelope Roskell is going to be joining us to talk about healthy, expressive piano technique. So I'm delighted that she's been able to join us. Welcome to the show, Penelope.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you all, and thank you for inviting me, Nicola.
Oh, our pleasure to have you on. It's such a treat to have you here. So for those that don't know anything about your story, Penelope, can you tell us how you got into teaching technique in particular and this specialty?
Well, I've always been a committed teacher from when I was even at school. But when I was at college, I injured my thumb, which meant that I had to really think very, very carefully about how I was playing and try to readdress all the technical misunderstandings I'd had. And there was nobody there at that time to help me, so I just had to work it all out for myself. And I looked into other sort of philosophies, and I studied yoga and Alexander and Tai Chi and a lot of other techniques as well. And then I've spent 40 years working out how to adapt all these ideas to the actual nitty-gritty of piano playing, and following on from that, obviously, the teaching. And what I'm really interested in at the moment is how we introduce all these ideas and these techniques into people right from the beginning of the teaching stages, so that, in the first few years, so that every student starts with the best possible technique, so they're not then having to correct things later, so that we're really setting them off with wonderful beginnings.
Yeah, that's absolutely a wonderful goal, and I'm sure one that many teachers will be on board with, most teachers, I hope, and especially those teachers who have been through a similar issues as you. I've never had any injuries, but I certainly learnt some technique that wasn't ideal and had to unlearn it myself along my journey. So not having that experience passed on to my students is something that I definitely strive for.
Mm.
So, Penelope, you have some wonderful tips to share with us, and I know we've a lot to explore. So, let's go ahead and dive into some of these fantastic tips.
Right, well, obviously we have just a very short amount of time here. So I just thought I'd as you said, scratch the surface with some ideas. As I say, I think all the main aspects of technique can be taught within the first 2 or 3 years. They really can. And because these technique is not just about finger technique. And I think, traditionally that's what people thought of it. They thought about learning the 5-finger position, being in the middle C position, and getting those 5 fingers working. And people saw that as what beginner's technique is about. The difficulty about that, I'm sure many of you know, is that if I go into this middle C position with both my thumbs on middle C, you see what happens to my arms. My elbows are pulled in towards the body. My shoulders are a little bit, they tend to come up and go in a little bit. And my hand is twisted a little bit into that position. It's called ulnar deviation. So if a student is only in that position for several months, then their arms will get a recognition that is how they're going to play the piano, and their muscles sort of adapt to that. So they're used to pulling in. So when they have to move out to the outer edges of the keyboard, for instance, their muscles will be saying, oh, but no, this is where I feel safe. And so there'll be a slight resistance to any quick leaps when we want to move out to the outer reaches of the piano, for instance. And obviously we don't want to get into the habit of always having shoulders a little bit forwards, upwards, and pulling tightly inwards. So this is another thing that we want to address right from the beginning. Just while I'm on that subject, one thing we can do there is just feel that we're actually taking the arms back first and then bringing them round, or just doing it this way, so that they're opening up first and then bringing their hands to the keyboard, so they're in a lovely aligned, coordinated arm position. Another thing that I think is really important is that we shouldn't be seeing technique as being completely divorced from the musical purpose. So the way I teach technique is I, for instance, see that there's going to be a technical problem in a piece that they're just about to start learning. So in advance, I start introducing that technique. And I'll start introducing it in a very broad way initially, in a very simple way, so that we're working at it step by step. So by the time they come to be learning that piece, even though it may be just a beginner's piece or it might be a more advanced piece, they're absolutely ready to tackle that piece. So we don't really want to be tackling the technique in the piece itself when we get to it, because at that stage we're also thinking about note learning, rhythm, two hands coordinated. So there's a lot of other difficulties. So what we want to be doing is prepare each technique in its simplest form well in advance of when it's going to be encountered in a piece of music. So I'm always thinking of a technique as this is preparation for what we're going to be doing next. And so technique is not just about, as I say, finger work. It's about how we use the whole body to produce the best possible sound and the right sound for that particular piece of music. If it's a piece about a blacksmith, we want a nice, vibrant, energetic sound. If it's about a river, we want a beautiful, flowing sound. So we're going to use different movements. So all the exercises I use are, they're what I call exercises in movement and sound. So they demonstrate how a particular movement will create a particular sound. So I start with something which is very, very simple, and then start to build on that till it becomes more of something which will be introduced into a piece. And I think we have to do this in a fun way. I don't think that technique should be seen as the boring thing that we do at the beginning of the practice or the beginning of the lesson. And then, now we get onto the nice music. I think technique has to be seen as fun. So that's why I'm trying to do really simple exercises that are based on natural movements, the sort of movements that we do every day. And I give them fun titles, and students can make up their own titles for them if they want, but they're all based on how animals move or little images that they might encounter or activities that they might be doing in their everyday life. So it feels relevant. It's not just about five-finger work.
Yeah, and it's musically, as you said, it's all musical. It's all part of music that they will be learning. So I
Yeah.
think I might know the answer, your answer to this question, but I'll let you answer it properly. Angie asked, what's your opinion about Hanonchery exercises regarding technique?
Right. Okay. Hanon is very much linked to just pure finger work on the whole. And it's very divorced from any musical context. So it's very easy to start playing those sort of exercises very mechanically. And some exercises are actually very dangerous. Things like the exercises where you hold down certain fingers and then play the other ones really forte. I do use certain finger patterns that come from Hanon, but I use them in a completely different way and a completely different technical approach. And one thing that I think Hanon says is you should lift your fingers high and with precision. And this, again, is not a good approach to technique, because if you're lifting your fingers high, what happens is you tighten the muscles here in the upper forearm. And so when you try and play the note down, this is resisting the movement. It's tight. So I keep saying to my students, the piano's down here. It's not up there. So any movement that you do upwards is a waste of energy. It's a waste of time. So it slows you down. And it doesn't actually enable you to play more loudly. Czerny, on the other hand, has a slightly more musical approach. What I do for some of the Czerny exercises is I've developed shortened versions of them, because I think we can waste a lot of time learning pages and pages of music, when all we're trying to do is to teach one particular movement which will produce a particular type of sound or be used then in another piece that you're playing. So it seems to me rather a waste of time learning 3 pages of a Chopin etude when you could just do an 8-bar version of it, and then immediately jump into some pieces of beautiful music. I've been writing I've been creating a course for teachers, an online course, which I could tell you more about later if you're interested. And in that, I do use some Czerny studies, but I tend to choose the sort of the 8 bars that are most relevant to one technique. So you're really focusing on starting with a very simple exercise, which doesn't even use any note learning at all, and then maybe putting that into practice in something very simple and very focused from, say, Czerny or another study, and then quickly jumping into how we can put it into practice in a piece of music. So it's actually a much quicker process because it doesn't involve so much note learning. And at the beginning stages, I use a lot of rote teaching anyway, so they're not even thinking about trying to read the notes, trying to read 2 hands, all that coordination, plus thinking about the movement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I never used Hanon growing up. None of my teachers really relied on Hanon, but I was introduced to Czerny, and I pretty much only practiced the shorter exercises from that book, because the longer ones, it just felt like, but I've so much work to do on these enormous pieces for my exams or whatever was going on. And I couldn't bring myself to practice several pages of what was supposed to be a technique exercise. So, yeah. But they are more musical in general than Hanon. So,
yeah, absolutely.
They do have that going for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining your thoughts on that. That's really interesting. So we've sort of had 2 tips so far. Am I right? We've got introduce technique really early on. Yeah. If we were to summarize them slightly, is to teach it right from the beginning and focus on making it broader almost, right out of that middle C position and opening things up from the beginning. And then to focus on making your technique exercise, if whatever exercises that you're doing, making them focused on the music and heading towards the music. Have I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I thought it would be useful to talk about a bit more about which movements I think we should introduce really early on. And there are 5 main movements that we use at the piano. Now, everybody will be quickly thinking, what are those 5 movements? Okay. And they're actually all things that we do in our everyday lives. So the first thing we do is to bring our hands up to play the piano, and then we put our hand down on the piano. So if we're playing chords, for instance, we're doing downward movements, which has to naturally be followed by an upward movement to take us to the next place or whatever. So the first movement we need to practice is just teaching them how to do a downward movement. And I start at the very early stages with just doing that onto one finger. Sometimes if the finger is very weak, I'll put the thumb behind the end joint of the finger and just practice on maybe with the 3rd finger initially. And we do an exercise that I call the parachute touch. And the purpose of this is to loosen everything up and to really coordinate the whole arm. So instead of coming to the keys in this way and feeling that everything feels a bit tight, the elbow feels a bit tight, and they can only move the fingers by themselves, or just move from here, what I'm trying to do is to give them a little bit more space, more freedom of the arm. So when they're playing a chord, they're actually flowing into it. And so I start by a very broad movement. And in a way, this is my 3rd point, Nicola, that we start with broad movements. Because if we're starting with tiny little movements, what tends to happen is the arm tightens up, the wrist tightens, the elbow tightens. And so we get a bit stuck. And then from then on, it's very difficult to loosen up following it. So I tried to start with very broad movements, which are very free. And one of the real sort of basic techniques I teach, not only to beginners, but to say there was a transfer intermediate student, you could teach it to them. Or if I get a new student who's a very advanced student, who's a little bit tense, I will teach it to them. So it can be used at all different levels. And I'll just show it to you in a very, very brief form, but it can be extended with a lot more detail. So you firstly just get the idea that a student is just swinging their arms. So they get feeling that it's very, very loosely swinging. So they're really loosening up the arm from the shoulder. And then they imagine that their arm is a hot air balloon and it just rises in front of them. Now you'll see what happens here is the whole arm is moving. I'm not just doing a movement from here. So the elbow is keeping soft and the wrist is very soft. And if the wrist is very soft, the hand just hangs and the hand becomes very relaxed as well. And then at this point, I transfer the image into the image of a parachute. And they just come down. And at first, they just come down onto their knee, or they come down onto a wooden surface, not even thinking about playing a note initially. So they just think that they can imagine that air just supporting the hand as it comes down, and it floats down very gradually. And as I say, you can just do that initially onto one finger, and then you can start to do it over wider distances. So then this starts to introduce the idea of a sideways movement. Okay, and this is very, very important because that's what pianists in general find get worried about doing sideways movements, particularly when they're fast. And the more freedom you've got of that movement, the easier it becomes. So right from the beginning stages, we can start to introduce that idea of just a coordinated arm movement, but also moving from side. So we can move on all the Ds. And we can vary it with different qualities of sound, with different speeds and different ways, different notes and so on. So then what we can start, so we've got there the downward movement, we've got the sideways movement. The way I first introduced the sideways movement actually is just what I call for adults dusting the keys, is just this movement. Right, so it's very, very free sideways movement. Okay, so it's a very broad movement again. Okay, and for younger kids, you can think about skateboarding because the idea is skateboarding across the skate. It's a very flowing movement, so you could call it skateboarding. And then that loosens everything up. So when they come to do it more precisely on individual notes, they still retain that freedom of the muscles and of the joints. So then we can also be thinking about what other movements are there. There's forward and back. Now, so many students, you see them doing this. They're playing their C major and they're in this position and they're on their white note position. And then when they play G major, this is what they do. They have to stretch out the fourth finger because they're not ready to play the black notes. Okay, so we need to have good flexibility of movement from the white notes to the black notes. So I actually introduce a chromatic scale quite early on because by then you can be, but with only one finger. So then we're already doing. So you see what happens, my whole arm has to loosen up to move forwards. So it's keeping that elbow very flexible. So we're not just getting into this position and then feeling we've got to try and reach out specific fingers to get to the black notes. So that's the third movement, right?
Right. Just to pause you there for 1 second, Penelope, because I have a question that's about something I've seen in my students. That first movement we're talking about with the downward motion and the parachute.
Yeah.
Some students, not most students, I'd say about 10 to 20%, and especially those who have ADHD or other learning difficulties, have a lot of hold extra tension in their body. And when you tell them to lift up their arms or you demonstrate that, the shoulders will come up too. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen that? And do you have any tips for reducing that tension in the shoulders?
Well, I think just by starting with that very loosely hanging motion this way, helps them get the idea that actually you can move the arm from the shoulder without this coming up. So this becomes, that's why I always start with this broad movement, and it's a very free movement. So that's what, if they're not ready for that yet, just get them doing some arm swinging exercises so that they get the idea that actually the arm swings from here.
Yeah.
We don't have to lift the shoulder to do it. And then eventually they get used to coming up and then just letting it drop down. And then eventually we talk about just feeling that the arm is just, you're standing in the ocean, the arms are just floating on the waves, they're just at playing height. So what we're doing here is using arm weight, basically. And we're teaching them gradually to use different types of arm weight and speed. And I talk about different types of parachutes. So if they've got a really good quality parachute, they'll come down really slowly and gently. It'll be pianissimo. And when they're a cat coming from the harness, hanging from a harness on the parachute. So they'll come down and they'll land on their feet. They're not just going to go splat. They really land nicely with a nice position. So there's lots of images we add to this parachute exercise. And of course, if the parachute doesn't open out at all, then they're going to be using full arm weight and they're just going to go splat. And some people find that an easier thing to learn first. So you have to adapt. You have to have lots of ideas in the back of your head, lots of technical exercises that you can call upon. And then if one doesn't work immediately for a student, then you try something else. And I'm still doing this. I've got, big fat book, hundreds of exercises that I use, that I teach. But I still sometimes have to think of a new one because it just doesn't work for that one particular student who's got a background in something else. And for some reason, a particular exercise doesn't work, then I have to think of a new one or modify it slightly.
Yeah, great tips there. Thank you for that. So we've had down, side to side, and forward. Is that right?
Yeah. So then we've got the rounded movements, this movement, which is sort of a combination of all those movements, really. It's a little bit of down, it's a little bit of sideways, it's a little bit of up and forwards and back. And so we can introduce that. We can introduce it really quite early on. But eventually it turns into these sort of things. So it becomes Chopin etudes, it becomes Chopin accompaniments. These rounded movements are in every piece of music. But we can introduce these much earlier than I think we traditionally thought. So that's a fourth movement that we can do. And then the last one is the rotation. I tend to bring that in last, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be introduced a little bit sooner. Again, we can start by just thinking that of a sort of rolling from side to side. We can just do this movement. Whatever happens, it should feel very, very loose and floppy. I talk about, it's an exercise I've got called pastry dough, where I think about the arm as just being like dough. It's really floppy, or bread dough, or whatever, pizza dough, whatever they want to think of it as. So that we're really getting a nice, very broad, floppy movement. And then they maybe start to just roll on the wood like this, just using their whole fist. And then they might just roll from 2 to 4th finger or 1 to 5th finger. And so for beginners, I do it very slow. So I'm just really loosening up that movement and feeling that everything is very, very loose. With a more advanced student, I would very quickly get into something much quicker because actually it's important to get them. So I'd really get them just loosening it up. But again, doing it away from the piano. So they're really starting, not worrying about notes, not worrying that it's a full octave, that it's not, the beginning of the Pathetique Sonata, which has the octave, just doing it at the simplest version, which is at the interval of a fifth, which is where the hand feels, fifth or sixth, where the hand feels most comfortable. So we can introduce each of these movements. So I'm talking about movements rather than techniques because it's the movements that give us the technique. Of course, there's finger technique as well, but I don't really want to get into that because that's more complex. But I think keeping all these movements free and easy and simple is what a lot of teachers find there's often just not quite enough time for. So it gets pushed aside. And then we get to, say, intermediate level, and they're already tense in certain movements, and then it's very difficult to change the habits.
Yes, absolutely. There's some great questions coming in, which I think relate to exactly that. Kathy asked, any suggestions for improving technique for a transfer student intermediate level who plays with very flat, weak fingers? She has very long fingers, and she's
Okay.
working with them flat.
Yeah. It would be interesting to find out whether that student is also hypermobile. Hypermobile is the same as double jointedness. And a lot of people who play with very flat fingers are that. And there are tests that you can do. But what that means is that these the intrinsic hand muscles are weak. These are the muscles that move in this way. I've got quite a lot of exercises. I call them the quacking duck, for instance, where you just actually, you can have little conversations and you do exercises like this. And what that is doing is actually strengthening those muscles. And again, you're doing it in a fun way. You're doing it away from the piano. So they're not trying to do complex note learning and subtle musical nuances at the same time as trying to strengthen these muscles. So yes, a lot of time is wasted on so-called strengthening exercises like the Hanon. I think some of them, if you don't know what you're doing, you're just repeating what you've always done. You're not actually making any improvement. But doing some little exercises, and there are quite a few of them in my book, The Complete Pianist, and also in the piano teachers course I've just been producing, which actually help to strengthen those little muscles around here, which keep that hand arch strong. And again, you can do that at quite an early stage, or you can just do them for an intermediate transfer student or for a very advanced student who's not got much support in that hand arch. And it doesn't actually take as long as you think to make that change.
Yeah. And I mean, you would need to go into the book and try some of the exercises, I think, because it would depend where the hypermobility is. I'm hypermobile in almost all my joints. So I would have loved to do the quacking duck when I was a kid, if only. But I didn't know about it then. But I think
some
it
people,
is.
right. So I got a little exercise which I call caterpillars for that. So we're sort of doing this and we're just walking along the keys and we do little races, and then you can do them all for this way. And so it's a fun way of strengthening those joints, again, away from the piano.
Yes, I think that's the piece that's often missing. And it is, as you say, we never quite find time for them. These things that could be done away from the piano. It seems like something that's taking up time when actually it's going to save you time because you won't have the issues to deal with that you can't end up remedying at the piano anyway. So
it takes a little bit more time at the beginning stages. And I know some parents feel they're in a hurry. They want to sort of pass the milestones. And sometimes it needs a bit of persuasion for parents to understand that this is putting everything in the bank, in the savings bank for the future. And it will avoid so much waste of time later on. Of struggling with technical issues then if you can get everything right at the beginning. So it really is worth taking that extra bit of time at the beginning to get these things really sorted.
I think it is. And I think if you communicate with parents, I don't think they actually will be as impatient as many teachers expect. And especially if you do teach by rote as well, as you've mentioned, they can still be playing beautiful music if we don't get so focused on reading, I think, in the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not against note reading at all. I think it's very important. But, we can, with each student, we have to find a slightly different balance. We have to work at their weak points. So if somebody's got a very strong hand arch, obviously I'm not going to work at finger strengthening exercises. If they've got a very tight elbow, then I'll work at other exercises. So you want to have a whole sort of bank of exercises in your experience that you can pull out when and if you need them. But there's no point in repeating something over and over again with a student who already can do something. That's not going to do anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. There was another great question from Ashmit though, about playing even semiquavers. So if a student is playing uneven semiquavers or 16th notes, have you found a particular root cause is often the problem there, or any tips for that in general? I know it depends on the context.
It's a huge question. It's very difficult to cover that in just a couple of minutes. There are a few issues there. One is what I call evenly curved fingers. So, for instance, when I demonstrated that G major scale, or say you're doing a D major scale and the fingerings, I don't start with fifth finger. I start with second finger, but I'll show you it with fifth finger. Now, what happens is the third finger comes over here, so it curls in to go onto the white note, and then you have to stretch out the second. Right? So you see some fingers are straightened, some are curled. If you try playing something evenly with that approach to the hand position, it will not sound even. It will be all over the place. So that's one thing to look out for, that you've got all the fingers are nicely evenly curved. So if you have to reach the black notes, you actually just move forward a little bit so that the fingers are naturally in the right position. The other thing is that actually trying to improve evenness by just working mechanically or doing dotted rhythms, which actually I don't think the dotted rhythms actually help to train evenness. But what tends to happen is people do a mechanical exercise to train the evenness, whereas actually what is the thing that's most important for training evenness is the quality of our listening. So if a student isn't listening and they don't notice that that fourth finger is slipping away, it's uneven, then however much they practice, it's not going to improve. So the first and most important thing is in the listening. And so, for instance, if they're doing a D major scale, or it does that, then yes, it can be useful to stop on that note that's gone weak. So just to really pinpoint, that's the note I need to think about. That's the note I need to listen for. It's not every note that's uneven in an uneven passage. There's usually just a few notes that maybe fourth finger, maybe 3, 4, 5 or something that they need to focus on. So we need to find where those are, listen for them, and then work on the technical issues of trying to help that become more even.
Yes, that's a great starting point. I know it was a huge question. I'll pass on one more question, and then I know you have a couple of other tips to share, and then we'll wrap up. But Angie had a question about adults. So what technique issues do you think exist uniquely for adult students, and how can we better help them? Is there any particular pitfalls you've seen with adult learners?
Well, I think there's very different types of adult learners, isn't there? There's the adult beginner. There's the very advanced adult. When at music college, I obviously see very advanced 18-year-olds coming, so they count as adult learners. So I think just as with beginners, we have child beginners and children, we have a huge range of different types of problems that we have to address. Many adults are quite stiff. So they really need loosening up exercises, usually rather more than strengthening exercise. Whereas a very young child will need some more strengthening exercises before they can sustain a forte, or even before they can even approach a piece and play it legato. So with adults, for me, I find it's more actually just getting them to loosen up. And actually, this might lead in quite nicely to my next point, which was about broad gestures. Because we think that if we're making broad gestures, we're going to be less accurate because we're going to exaggerate everything. But what happens if you start with a broad gesture? So for instance, I have a student who needs to do an octave and they have to get from here or leap from here to here. So 1 and then 5. What I would do firstly is make it bigger. So I might even just do a very broad. So they get it completely loose and floppy. So they're not worried about the notes, right? And then I'll go on to it and I might do a bigger gesture. So again, we've got a very free, loose movement. And then when we bring it down to what is actually in the score, it feels easier. And it's so loose that the movement becomes flowing. And if a movement is flowing, it actually produces greater accuracy in the end than if we're anxious, we're trying to get there as quickly as possible. What happens is that the muscles sort of tense up with the anxiety, with the mental and the physical anxiety. And so, in fact, we're more likely to play the wrong notes. So I think people think, if somebody exaggerates a movement too much, they're worried about the wrong notes. And I'm forever saying to my students when I'm teaching them a new technique, don't worry about the notes for the moment. I don't care what notes you play. Just get the movement And then after a bit, you'll suddenly find it calms down, it's refined, and it becomes very, very accurate because it's nicely free, it's flowing, and you can easily just find your way to the notes without any tension building up.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen that a lot with adult students as well. Is the main issue is the tension and the obsession with playing the right notes and trying to control it in
Yeah,
a way that kids won't usually. I mean, you do have perfectionist little kids, but most will be a lot freer with things. And as you said, we'll need more work on strengthening rather than the fluidity and the broad gestures, as you say. But you're absolutely right. It's much more accurate, and I find myself saying that a lot as well. Is that fluid movement, that flowing movement, as you called it, is going to have a much more accurate result that you will land on the right key. I mean, so often I've seen adults who make a claw when they're trying to play several chords in a row because they're
yeah,
trying to keep the same shape. They know it's the same shape.
yeah, yeah, yes, yeah. And my last point was a very simple one, which was just planning ahead, which I um, sort of gone into a little bit anyway, because I'm sure the people watching this aren't the teachers who immediately they've um, passed grade 2 immediately started bringing grade 3 pieces. I think that's a big mistake because what we want to be doing after, say, an exam like that is we want to be preparing the ground for the next stage. So that's a great time to be introducing new exercises, new little studies and things, and keeping the variety so that by the time they start to go to pieces that are at a slightly higher level, they're ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. To plan ahead is great. I'll slip in one final question from the chat there, which just in case you have experience in this area, Penelope, it's just from Lee. I have a young adult beginner who already has arthritis. So they're a young adult student, but they've already developed arthritis. Any
Yeah.
tips to help her? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I work in a musician's clinic with musicians who've got hand problems of all kinds and pains and things. So we get quite a lot of people with arthritis. It can be very distressing for them, but you can encourage that person that playing the piano is very, very good for them, and they've probably even been recommended it by their physician. So it's good to do. It depends where the arthritis is, what the restrictions are. It will restrict some of the movements. But I think it's really important for you as a teacher to make sure that they're not hitting the keys with they don't want too much impact of the keys. So that's where, for instance, the parachute touch brings the hand down onto the keys with a soft motion. There's not a hard impact. And once you get a hard impact, you get tension in the wrist, tension in the elbow. And you don't want that. You want to keep everything soft because any harsh impact and they might find that, say, if it's got arthritis in the thumb, that might mean that their stretch is a little bit reduced. So depending on what it is, you might have to make a few modifications, but overall, the piano playing is really one of the best things they can possibly do to keep their fingers moving.
Yes, I've certainly had students who have been recommended piano for that reason as well. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's a good thing for
yeah,
her to be doing and good to be researching what you can do to help her more. So we've only scratched the surface of this, but you've given some amazing tips. I know there's so much more because I've had the pleasure of watching several of your videos and picked up so many, even just the wonderful little analogies you share through the discussion has been amazing for me to pick up on those and take out little bits and pieces. And that's just, again, on watching a few of the videos, not even the full course. So can you share with everyone a little bit more about the course, what's involved in it, and I know we have a discount code that's in the description so people can get the link there, but just tell us a little bit more about the course.
Okay. So a couple of years ago, this book came out. It's the Complete Pianist, and I know a lot of people know about that already. And it has videos in it already. But I wanted to do something which was very specific to teachers, and which so I and on the technique side. So I'm taking some of the sections from this book, but I've expanded those very much from a teacher's point of view and showing how to put them into practice in your teaching practice. So what I'm trying to do is exactly what I've been talking about here today, is start with a very, very simple exercise that you can introduce at the beginning, and then show how you can develop that for intermediates and to advanced. And so the course, I started off offering it as a face input. Well, online in person is very confusing. All of this, isn't it? Earlier in the year, but now what we've done is recorded every session, so it works out as 9 hours of video in total. And you can watch them all sort of one after the other, or you can, if you have a student who's got some problems with playing chords of a certain type of chords or something, you could just dip into that section and refresh yourself on it. And it's got lots of musical examples. It gives you the examples at the bottom of the page, so you've got them all there. It's got summaries, it's got little notes and things on it as well. So there's a lot of material there. And it's designed for teachers to help them with that aspect of their teaching, because I feel this is one thing that teachers often feel very lacking in confidence about, because none of us quite remember how we were taught technique at the beginning stages, and so we can't just rely on our memory of how we were taught. So we do need some extra help with that, I find. So that's why I've produced this resource. And so if you want to access it, you can get a hold of it on my website, which is just peneloperoskell.co.uk. And there's a section which is called the Roskell Academy, and the course is in there. And the publishers produced a voucher for people who are watching this show today, and it's Technique 22. So that should be fairly easy to remember, I think.
Yeah, as I said, it's all in the description. So the link is right there. You can click through. That'll give you more information about the course, and there's a little taster video and everything. And then the code is there as well. So if you do want to get it. Penelope, also hold up your book for those who haven't seen it already.
It's that. The Complete Pianist. From healthy technique to natural artistry. So you can see it follows on very much from the ideas we've been talking about today, how we start with a freely flowing technique, which then will be put into practice in more and more complex pieces of music. But it all stems from these initial first movements that we want to get in the right sort of way.
Yes, beautiful descriptions of them. Penelope, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope people check out the course and the book, whichever suits them, and explore your ideas further, because I think this is such an important topic. And as you say, many teachers don't feel confident in this area and can be a bit bashful about seeking out advice. So it's great that that resource is out there.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, thank you very much. Hope you found it useful.
Thank you for coming on. Talk to you soon.